I forced my son to divorce his wife, and for 7 days my entire family treated me like a monster. They said I was jealous. They said I was controlling. My own son looked me in the eye and told me he could never forgive me. But 7 days later, every one of them stood in stunned silence, wishing they had listened sooner. My name is Evelyn Parker. I am 68 years old, a widow, a mother, and until recently, I believe that if you loved your family enough, they would eventually understand your intentions. I was wrong. The day everything changed began with a Sunday dinner at my son Ethan's house. The smell of roasted chicken filled the kitchen. Soft music played from a speaker near the window, and the late afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor. From the outside, it looked like the kind of family gathering people post on social media. Smiles, laughter, warm plates, familiar faces. Ethan sat at the head of the table, relaxed and happy. Beside him was Vanessa, his wife of 4 years. Everyone adored her. She volunteered at charity events, remembered birthdays, sent thoughtful cards, and somehow always knew exactly what to say. My sister called her an angel. My neighbors called her a dream daughter-in-law. Even Ethan often joked that he had married the perfect woman. I smiled when people said those things. What else could I do? If I had spoken honestly, nobody would have believed me. Over the previous 6 months, I had noticed things that did not fit the image everyone else saw. Tiny things. A look that lasted a second too long. A conversation that ended the moment I entered the room. Stories that changed slightly every time they were told. Alone, each detail meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern that kept me awake at night. That evening, Vanessa carried a bowl of mashed potatoes to the table and laughed at something Ethan said. Everyone laughed with her. I watched quietly. She caught my eye for a moment. Just a moment. Then she smiled. Most people would have seen warmth in that smile. I saw calculation. A week earlier, I had learned something that shattered every assumption I had made about her. Something so serious that I spent 3 sleepless nights hoping I was mistaken. I checked. Then I checked again. The facts never changed. I remember staring at the evidence spread across my dining room table and feeling my stomach drop. Not because I hated Vanessa. The truth was much worse. I knew what would happen if I exposed what I had found. Ethan would not believe me. The family would not believe me. I would become the villain in everyone's story. And that is exactly what happened. After dinner, I asked Ethan to speak with me privately. We stepped onto the back patio. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass from a nearby yard. Ethan smiled and asked what was on my mind. I looked at my son, the little boy I had once carried through thunderstorms because he was afraid of the dark. Then I told him something that changed both of our lives. You need to divorce Vanessa, I said. The smile vanished from his face. At first he thought I was joking. Then he realized I was serious. What happened next would divide our family, destroy relationships, and set in motion a chain of events none of us could stop. And before the week was over, the truth would reveal itself in a way no one expected. The silence after my words felt heavier than the cool evening air around us. Ethan stared at me as if I had suddenly become a stranger. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A car passed on the street. Inside the house, I could still hear faint laughter from the family gathered around the dinner table. It sounded like a completely different world. What did you just say? Ethan finally asked. His voice was calm, but I recognized the warning beneath it. I folded my hands together to keep them steady. You heard me. He shook his head slowly. No, I do not think I did. The disappointment in his eyes cut deeper than anger ever could have. I had spent 38 years protecting him from pain. Now I was voluntarily stepping into the role of the person causing it. You need to end this marriage before it is too late, I said. Ethan laughed once, but there was no humor in it. Too late for what? I looked away toward the backyard fence. The white paint reflected the fading sunlight. I wished the answer were simple. I wished I could hand him proof that would instantly make him understand. But life rarely worked that way. People believed what they wanted to believe, especially when love was involved. I cannot explain everything yet, I said carefully. But I need you to trust me. His expression hardened immediately. Trust you, he asked. You are asking me to leave my wife without giving me a reason. I knew how unreasonable it sounded. If someone had asked me to do the same thing years earlier, I would have reacted exactly as Ethan was reacting now. That realization made the conversation even more painful. There is a reason, I said quietly. A serious one. Ethan crossed his arms. Then tell me. I opened my mouth and then closed it again. The truth was not ready. Not yet. One missing piece still separated suspicion from certainty. Until I had that piece, anything I said would sound like accusation rather than fact. I cannot, I answered. Not tonight. The look on his face changed. Confusion became frustration. Frustration became anger. Then this conversation is over. He turned toward the house. Ethan. He stopped, but did not face me. I am trying to protect you. He laughed again, more bitterly this time. From the woman who loves me? I did not answer. A moment later, he walked back inside. Through the glass door, I saw Vanessa look up immediately. She had been watching. Even from a distance, I noticed how quickly she read his expression. She stood and touched his arm. He said something. Her eyes shifted toward me. For the briefest second, the warm smile everyone adored disappeared. What replaced it was impossible to mistake. It was not fear. It was calculation. Then it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. By the time the others noticed, she looked concerned and supportive once again. I drove home alone that night. The roads were quiet. Streetlights stretched across the windshield like pale ribbons. My small house sat exactly where it always had, at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac lined with maple trees. Yet when I stepped inside, everything felt different. I turned on a lamp in the living room and sat in my favorite chair. The house was silent except for the ticking clock above the fireplace. My late husband, Robert, had bought that clock 20 years earlier. He used to joke that it ticked loudly enough to remind us time was valuable. That night, every tick felt like a countdown. I thought about Ethan. I thought about the trust one had just damaged. Most of all, I thought about Vanessa. For 4 years, she had carefully built an image that nobody questioned. For years of smiles, generosity, and perfect timing. For years of becoming exactly who everyone wanted her to be. But a week earlier, something had happened that cracked the foundation beneath that image. And the next morning, I was going to find out whether that crack led to the truth I feared most. The next morning began like most mornings in my quiet neighborhood. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the counter while the coffee maker hummed softly in the background. I should have felt comforted by the familiar routine, but a weight sat heavily in my chest. For nearly a week, I had been replaying the same moment over and over again. It started at a charity fundraiser held at a hotel about 15 miles from my home. I had attended only because a friend from church asked me to join her. Vanessa had been there as well, moving gracefully through the crowd, smiling at donors, shaking hands, looking exactly like the woman everyone admired. I remember standing near a refreshment table when another woman entered the ballroom. She appeared to be in her mid-40s, dressed simply, with tired eyes that seemed to carry years of disappointment. The moment she noticed Vanessa, she froze. It was subtle. Most people would not have seen it. But I did. Her entire expression changed. Shock first, then concern, then something that looked very much like fear. A few minutes later, while Vanessa was speaking with a group of guests, the woman approached me. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "Are you related to Vanessa Parker?" The question caught me off guard. I told her that Vanessa was my daughter-in-law. The woman hesitated. She glanced across the room toward Vanessa and then back at me. "I think you should be careful," she said. I asked what she meant, but she immediately looked uncomfortable. She apologized and walked away before I could ask anything else. Most people would have forgotten the conversation. I could not. Something about her expression stayed with me. 2 days later, I returned to the same hotel for another community event. By coincidence, I saw the woman again. This time I approached her. Her name was Grace Wilson. At first, she refused to talk. She said she did not want trouble. She said she had spent years trying to move on with her life. But eventually she agreed to have coffee with me at a small cafe across town. I still remember the nervous way she wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She looked like someone debating whether to open a door that had remained locked for a long time. "You deserve to know who Vanessa really is," she finally said. The word sent a chill through me. Grace explained that she had known Vanessa years earlier in another state. Not casually, closely. According to Grace, Vanessa had a history of reinventing herself whenever circumstances became inconvenient. New cities, new friendships, new versions of the same story. None of what Grace described was illegal. None of it sounded dramatic when viewed separately. But together, the pattern felt unsettling. Relationships built on carefully crafted narratives. Important details omitted. People encouraged to believe only what Vanessa wanted them to see. I listened for nearly 2 hours. Several times I wanted to stand up and leave. Several times I told myself there had to be some misunderstanding. Yet every example Grace provided was accompanied by specific dates, locations, and names. Details are difficult to fake. That evening I returned home and began checking what I could verify. At first I expected to prove Grace wrong. Instead, small inconsistencies started appearing. Tiny things. Employment dates that did not match previous stories. Addresses that had never been mentioned. Entire chapters of Vanessa's past that Ethan had apparently never heard about. None of it proved malicious intent. Not yet. But the deeper I looked, the more questions emerged. By the time I finished reviewing everything that night, I realized one thing with absolute certainty. The woman my son believed he had married was not the complete person Vanessa had presented herself to be. And somewhere beneath those missing pieces was a truth that she desperately wanted hidden. For the next several days, my life became a routine of quiet observation. I attended my usual church meetings, watered the flowers on my front porch, and smiled politely whenever neighbors asked about Ethan and Vanessa. On the surface, nothing had changed. Underneath, everything had. Each evening I sat at my dining room table with a notebook and a growing collection of questions. The more I verified, the more uncomfortable I became. Vanessa had always been remarkably careful. That was what made the situation so difficult. There were no dramatic discoveries, no shocking headlines, no obvious scandals. Instead, there were gaps, missing pieces, entire stretches of her past that seemed to disappear whenever someone looked too closely. One afternoon, I called a former employer whose name Grace had mentioned. I expected the conversation to end quickly. Instead, the woman on the phone hesitated when I mentioned Vanessa. She was polite, but I could hear caution in her voice. She confirmed only a few details, yet even those details contradicted stories Vanessa had told our family over the years. Later that evening, I opened an old photo album Ethan had shared online shortly after his wedding. There was Vanessa smiling beside him on a beach in Florida, her arm linked through his. Looking at the picture, I felt a wave of sadness. Ethan was completely genuine in every photograph. His happiness was real. That was what frightened me most. He trusted completely. He always had. Even as a child, he believed the best about people. It was one of the qualities I loved most about him. It was also the quality that made him vulnerable. 3 days after my conversation with Grace, I noticed something else. Vanessa suddenly became unusually interested in Ethan's financial planning. During a family lunch, she guided multiple conversations toward investments, retirement accounts, property ownership, and long-term assets. Nobody else seemed to notice. Why would they? Married couples discuss financial matters all the time. Yet something about her questions felt rehearsed, deliberate. She was gathering information while appearing casual. That night, I remembered another moment from several months earlier. Ethan had mentioned updating certain legal documents. At the time, Vanessa had shown an unusual level of enthusiasm. I had dismissed it as responsible planning. Now the memory returned with a different meaning. Once I started connecting these moments, I could not stop. Small conversations, subtle reactions, carefully timed suggestions. Every memory felt like another puzzle piece sliding into place. Then came the discovery that finally pushed me from suspicion into action. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. Grace called unexpectedly. Her voice sounded tense. She told me she had remembered something important and wanted to meet in person. We met at a small coffee shop about 20 minutes outside town. The moment she sat down, I knew this was different. She reached into her purse and removed an envelope. Inside were copies of old documents she had kept for years. Some involved business arrangements from Vanessa's past. Others contained information about relationships and commitments that had ended abruptly once certain goals had been achieved. None of the papers alone proved wrongdoing. Together, however, they revealed a consistent pattern. Vanessa moved through life by becoming exactly who people wanted her to be until she no longer needed them. I drove home in silence after that meeting. The sky was turning orange as the sun lowered behind the trees. For the first time, I stopped asking whether I was mistaken. The question had changed. Now I was asking how much time remained before Ethan learned the truth the hard way. And deep in my heart, I feared the answer was not measured in years or months. It might be measured in days. The following morning, I woke before sunrise. The house was still dark, and for several minutes I sat at the edge of my bed listening to the quiet. There was a time when silence brought me peace. Lately, it only gave my thoughts more room to grow. I walked into the kitchen, made a cup of coffee, and stared out the window at the empty street. The neighborhood looked unchanged, but I felt as though I were standing on the edge of something I could not stop. By then, I had spent days collecting information, checking details, and forcing myself to separate facts from emotion. I wanted to be wrong. Every new discovery felt less like a victory and more like a loss. Around 10 o'clock that morning, Ethan called. His voice sounded cheerful. He was talking about a weekend trip he and Vanessa were planning. He mentioned a cabin rental, a lake, and a few days away from work. I listened quietly while he described their plans. Then he said something that immediately caught my attention. Vanessa had encouraged him to move up several financial decisions they had originally planned to make later in the year. He said it casually, as if it were no different from discussing vacation dates or grocery shopping. My grip tightened around the phone. What kind of decisions? I asked. Ethan laughed lightly. Nothing major. Just paperwork. Updating a few things. Combining some accounts. Simplifying everything. Simplifying. It sounded harmless. Responsible, even. Yet the words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Later that afternoon, I met Grace again. We sat on a shaded bench in a public park while children played on a nearby playground. Grace seemed nervous. She kept glancing around before speaking. There is something else, she said quietly. She explained that years earlier, Vanessa had developed a habit of accelerating major life changes whenever she believed an opportunity might disappear. Relationships moved quickly. Commitments moved quickly. Financial decisions moved quickly. According to Grace, patience had never been one of Vanessa's strengths. The information itself was not proof of anything, but combined with everything else, it formed a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. That evening I reviewed my notes again. The timeline bothered me most. Several events that had seemed unrelated now appeared connected. Conversations, documents, sudden urgency, carefully timed discussions about assets and future planning. For the first time, I stopped focusing on the past and started looking toward the future. What was Vanessa preparing for? The answer arrived unexpectedly the next day. A former acquaintance of Grace contacted me. She was reluctant to get involved, but after hearing why I was asking questions, she agreed to speak. We met at a diner just outside town. The woman did not tell me anything dramatic. Instead, she shared something far more useful. She described a recurring pattern. Vanessa would often maintain a carefully managed image while quietly preparing a completely different next step. By the time people realized what was happening, the important decisions had already been made. I drove home with a knot in my stomach. The pieces were finally beginning to fit together. I sat at my dining room table and spread out everything I had collected over the past week. Notes, dates, names, observations. When viewed separately, they seemed insignificant. Together, they painted a picture I could no longer ignore. That was the moment I made my decision. Waiting was no longer an option. If I stayed silent, Ethan would continue moving forward without seeing the risks ahead of him. If I spoke, he would probably hate me. The choice should have been difficult. Somehow it was not. I knew my son. I knew exactly how he would react. He would defend Vanessa. He would question my motives. He would believe I was trying to control his life. But I also knew something else. The window to protect him was closing. And according to everything I had uncovered, I estimated there were no more than 7 days left before a series of decisions would become impossible to reverse. 2 days later, I asked Ethan to meet me again. This time, there was no family dinner, no distractions, and no opportunity for anyone to interrupt. We met at a small park near the edge of town where he used to play Little League baseball when he was a boy. The field was empty except for a groundskeeper mowing grass in the distance. Ethan arrived looking exhausted. The warmth that normally appeared whenever he saw me was gone. He sat across from me on a wooden bench and waited. "I hope you are ready to explain yourself," he said. His voice was controlled, but I could hear the frustration underneath. I took a slow breath. "I need you to postpone every financial change you and Vanessa are planning." His expression darkened immediately. "This again?" I nodded. "Yes, this again." Ethan stood and began pacing a few feet away. "You still refuse to tell me exactly why." "Because I am still verifying certain things." "Then you are asking me to damage my marriage based on suspicion." I remained silent. Sometimes silence sounds like guilt. I knew that. Yet I also knew that speaking too soon could destroy any chance of him believing me later. Ethan stopped pacing and looked directly at me. "Do you know what Vanessa thinks?" he asked. I did not answer. "She thinks you have never accepted her." The words stung because they were not entirely false. Not because I disliked Vanessa, but because something about her had never felt genuine. "This is not about acceptance," I said quietly. "It is about protection." Ethan shook his head. Protection from what? Again, I could not answer in the way he wanted. His disappointment became anger. "You are making accusations without evidence." "No," I replied softly. "I am asking you to slow down until the evidence becomes clear." He laughed bitterly. "Do you hear yourself?" Before I could respond, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and immediately answered. "Vanessa." I watched his expression change as he spoke with her. His shoulders relaxed. His voice softened. Within seconds, she had calmed emotions that had taken me an hour to navigate. When the call ended, Ethan slipped the phone back into his pocket. "She is worried about me," he said. "She always is." I looked away toward the empty baseball field. There was no point arguing. Every word I spoke pushed him further away. By the time we parted that afternoon, I knew I had lost him. The next 48 hours were even worse. Family members began calling. My sister accused me of interfering in Ethan's happiness. A cousin told me I needed to apologize before permanent damage was done. Even neighbors seemed aware that tension existed between us. Somehow the story had spread, though I suspected Vanessa had shared only the version that made sense to everyone else. The lonely mother, the loving couple, the unnecessary conflict. It was a simple story. People prefer simple stories. On Friday evening, Ethan came to my house unannounced. He looked tired, older somehow. We sat across from each other at my kitchen table, the same table where I had spent days organizing notes and searching for answers. "I need to ask you one last time," he said. "Do you have actual proof?" I looked at him for several seconds before answering. "Not enough yet." His eyes closed briefly. When he opened them again, I saw resignation. "Then I am done discussing this." The room felt colder. "Ethan," he stood. "I love you, Mom. But I am not going to let you destroy my marriage." Those words stayed with me long after he left. Destroy my marriage. That was how everyone saw me now. Not as a mother trying to protect her son. Not as someone carrying a burden she wished she did not have. I had become the villain. Yet even as the front door closed behind him, I noticed something on the table beside my notebook. Earlier that afternoon, a message had arrived from Grace. It contained a new piece of information. A piece important enough to change everything. And for the first time, I believed the truth was finally close enough to touch. I stared at Grace's message for nearly an hour before responding. The information she sent was not dramatic on the surface. There were no shocking photographs or sensational accusations. Instead, there was a name, an address, and a timeline. The kind of information that seems ordinary until it connects to everything else. The next morning, I drove nearly 40 miles to meet someone Grace believed could answer the questions that had haunted me for days. The woman who opened the door was polite but cautious. She was retired now and clearly reluctant to revisit old memories. At first, she offered only vague responses. Then I mentioned Vanessa. Everything changed. A shadow crossed her face. She invited me inside and asked me to sit down. For the next hour, she carefully described a pattern she had witnessed years earlier. She spoke about promises that never matched actions, about plans that always seemed to benefit one person more than anyone else, about relationships that appeared strong until a specific goal had been reached. Nothing she said was illegal. Nothing she said would convince Ethan on its own. Yet every detail aligned perfectly with everything Grace had already told me. When I finally left, I sat in my car for several minutes without starting the engine. My hands rested on the steering wheel while I stared through the windshield. The truth was no longer hiding behind uncertainty. I could see its outline clearly. The problem was that Ethan still could not. Later that afternoon, I received another call. This time it came from a financial advisor who had worked with Ethan in the past. He did not reveal confidential information. He simply confirmed that several major decisions were scheduled for the following week. Important signatures. Important transfers. Important commitments. My heart sank. The timeline matched exactly what I feared. 7 days. That was all. 7 days before decisions would be finalized. 7 days before Ethan would place even more trust into a situation he did not fully understand. That evening, I made the hardest choice of my life. I called Ethan and asked him to meet me one last time. We sat across from each other in a quiet diner just off the highway. Rain tapped softly against the windows, while waitresses carried coffee pots between tables. Ethan looked exhausted. The strain of the past week was visible on his face. Before he could speak, I placed a folder on the table between us. He looked down at it, but did not touch it. "What is this?" he asked. "Everything I have found." He stared at the folder for several seconds. Then he slowly pushed it back toward me. "I am not doing this anymore." The words landed harder than I expected. "Please," I said quietly. "Just look at it." He shook his head. "No," I felt my chest tighten. "Ethan, you have spent days investigating my wife." His voice remained calm, which somehow hurt more than anger. "Do you understand how that sounds?" I did understand. That was the problem. From his perspective, I had become exactly what everyone believed. A controlling mother unable to let go. A woman searching for flaws where none existed. The villain in a story that seemed obvious to everyone except me. "I am trying to help you," I whispered. Ethan looked at me for a long moment. Then he stood. "If you truly wanted to help me, you would trust my judgment." I watched him walk toward the exit. Halfway to the door, he stopped. For a moment, I thought he might turn around. Instead, he spoke without facing me. "Vanessa and I have made a decision." My stomach dropped. "What decision?" He hesitated. "You will find out soon enough." Then he left. I remained in that booth long after he was gone. The rain continued falling outside. The folder sat untouched on the table. And for the first time since this began, I realized I might already be too late. The next morning arrived with an uneasy stillness that seemed to settle over everything. I woke before dawn and sat in my kitchen watching the sky slowly brighten beyond the window. The folder still rested on the table where I had left it the night before. Untouched, unread, rejected. For the first time since this ordeal began, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that I had failed. Maybe Ethan would move forward with every decision he and Vanessa had planned. Maybe the warnings would come too late. Maybe the truth would remain hidden until the damage was done. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and immediately recognized Ethan's number. My heart skipped. I answered on the second ring. "Mom." Something in his voice was wrong. Gone was the frustration. Gone was the certainty. In its place was confusion. "What happened?" I asked quietly. There was a long pause. "Vanessa left this morning." I sat perfectly still. "What do you mean she left?" "I mean she is gone." His words sounded distant, as though he were struggling to process them himself. "She packed several bags before sunrise and drove away." A chill moved through me. Did she say where she was going? No, another silence followed. Then he added, "She left a note." I closed my eyes. Every fear I had carried for days suddenly felt real. Ethan continued speaking. His voice sounded hollow now. The note said she needed space. She said she felt overwhelmed. She said she needed time to think. I listened without interrupting. "That is not all," he said. "There are other things." My grip tightened around the phone. "What things?" Several accounts were emptied. The room seemed to grow colder. "Not everything," he continued quickly, "but enough that I noticed immediately." I stared out the window at the quiet street. For days I had worried this moment might come. Now it was here. "Ethan," I said softly, "are you alone?" "Yes. I am coming over." The drive to his house felt longer than usual. Gray clouds covered the sky, and a light rain began falling halfway there. When I arrived, Ethan was sitting alone at his kitchen table. The house felt different. Empty. Silent. The cheerful atmosphere Vanessa had always created was gone. In its place was a stillness that felt almost unfamiliar. Ethan looked exhausted. He slid a piece of paper across the table. The note. I read it carefully. Every sentence was vague. Every explanation avoided specifics. There was nothing concrete. Nothing that truly explained why she had left so suddenly. "There is more," Ethan said quietly. He opened his laptop and showed me several messages he had discovered that morning. Conversations. Arrangements. Plans that had never been mentioned to him. None of them were dramatic on their own. Yet together they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Vanessa had been preparing for this departure far longer than anyone realized. I watched the color drain from Ethan's face as he reviewed the evidence himself. The realization was unfolding slowly, painfully, piece by piece. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked at me. The confidence that had filled his voice for weeks was gone. "You knew something was wrong." It was not a question. I nodded. I knew enough to be worried. Ethan lowered his eyes, and I refused to listen. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The sound filled the silence between us. Then his phone vibrated again. Another notification. Another discovery. He opened it and froze. I watched his expression change. Confusion became disbelief. Disbelief became shock. Slowly, he set the phone down on the table. "Mom," he whispered, "I think this is even bigger than I thought." For a long moment, neither of us moved. The notification remained on Ethan's screen while rain continued tapping against the windows. Finally, he turned the laptop toward me. What I saw was not a dramatic confession or a shocking message. It was something much simpler. Travel confirmations, reservation records, plans that had been arranged weeks before any of the conversations Vanessa claimed had left her uncertain about the future. The dates told the story more clearly than any explanation could. She had been preparing to leave long before she packed those bags. Ethan stared at the screen as if willing the information to change. "She already knew," he whispered. "She had already decided." I did not answer. Some truths hurt too much to rush. The rest of that afternoon passed in a blur of phone calls, emails, and discoveries. Every few hours another missing piece appeared. Old conversations, financial arrangements, commitments that had never been discussed openly. None of it looked like the marriage Ethan thought he had been living in. By evening, several family members had learned what happened. The same relatives who had criticized me only days earlier suddenly sounded very different. My sister called first. Her voice was hesitant. She asked if the reports were true. Then came my cousin. Then two neighbors. The certainty they once carried was gone. In its place was disbelief. The following day, Ethan asked me to come back to the house. When I arrived, I found him sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by paperwork. The confident man who had defended every decision now looked exhausted. Older. Humbled. For several minutes we reviewed everything together. Not because I wanted to prove I had been right. At that point, being right felt meaningless. I would have preferred to be wrong. Much wronger. Eventually Ethan pushed the papers aside and looked at me. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. "Why did you keep trying?" he asked quietly. I thought about the question before. Answering. "Because you are my son." He lowered his head. "After everything I said to you. That does not change who you are." Silence settled between us. Then, for the first time since this began, Ethan smiled slightly. It was a sad smile, but it was genuine. "I owe you an apology." I shook my head. "You do not owe me anything." "Yes, I do." His voice cracked slightly. "You tried to protect me, and I treated you like the enemy." I looked out the window toward the backyard where the rain had finally stopped. Water still clung to the grass, reflecting the afternoon sunlight. "Sometimes the people trying to protect us are the ones we resist the most," I said. Over the next few weeks, life slowly settled into a new rhythm. The shock faded. The confusion faded. Even the anger faded. What remained was perspective. Ethan began rebuilding the parts of his life that had been shaken. Family relationships gradually healed. Conversations became easier. Trust returned one careful step at a time. One Sunday afternoon, several relatives gathered for dinner at my house. The atmosphere felt different from the gatherings before all of this happened. There was more honesty in the room. More humility. At one point, my sister quietly pulled me aside. "I misjudged you," she admitted. I smiled and squeezed her hand. "You were not the only one." Later that evening, after everyone left, I stood alone in my kitchen washing dishes. The house was peaceful. The clock above the fireplace ticked softly in the background. I thought about everything that had happened during those 7 days. The accusations, the loneliness, the doubt, the painful choices. Looking back, I realized something important. I never won anything. There was no victory, no triumph. There was only a mother who saw danger approaching and refused to look away, even when doing so cost her the trust of the people she loved most. And in the end, the truth did what the truth always does. It arrived in its own time, spoke for itself, and left the entire family speechless.